maybe we'll go ahead and finish out with Sean and Nick from RGS. They'll be closing out our presentations today. So Sean Sean has been working with us to help plan this virtual workshop. And he's a forest conservation coordinator with RGS in Southern Appalachia, and Nick is the forest conservation director for RGS. So I will turn it over to them with the final presentation of the webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. Give me a second to pull up the presentation and share my screen. We'll be good to go. All right, cool. Can everybody see that?
Yep, looks good.
Good. Great. So thanks so much to everyone that helped pull together this event. Really happy to be here with everyone today. As was mentioned, Nick Biemiller. I am the Forest Conservation Director for the Southern Appalachian region with Ruffed Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society. I am based in Western North Carolina. I manage our regional conservation program across the mountain regions of 6 states, which for us is North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Southwest Virginia. So I'm going to talk to you all today about some of our work, about dynamic forest restoration blocks in the region, and some stuff that we're doing relating to late successional management. So first, for those that might be less familiar with us, RGS and AWS is a national conservation nonprofit. Our mission is to promote healthy forests and abundant wildlife. Obviously, as our name implies, ruffed grouse and American woodcock are our 2 primary flagship species. But when we think about our conservation work, we really are thinking about healthy forests, abundant wildlife, and conservation ethics in the broader senses of the words. So why ruffed grouse? I do want to give a little bit of species-specific information about ruffed grouse here in the Southern Appalachians. So we know that we've lost over 71% of ruffed grouse population abundance over the past 3 decades, and that is a pretty concerning, pretty steep decline for a species over only a 3-decade period. We know that the primary driver of that decline is the lack of habitat diversity, and specifically the lack of young forest conditions, those actively regenerating 5 to 20-year-old forests that provide that high stem density and critical cover for grouse and a lot of wildlife for parts of their life cycle needs. But it's not just about young forest when we think about grouse. It's about the interspersion and the juxtaposition of young forest stands with other more diverse forest conditions, including that landscape level diversity of the right amount of early, mid, and late successional forests at functional landscape scales that have biologically significant impact. Here in the Southern Appalachians, we think about grouse as a bellwether to grouse populations further north. This is the southernmost extent of ruffed grouse's range in the eastern United States. The continued declines that we've seen of the species here, with grouse being a climate-sensitive bird, does not look good for grouse in other parts of its range further north where it is more abundant. So declines down here are indicative of ongoing future declines that we can expect further north, making this area really ground zero when it comes to grouse conservation in the eastern United States. We also think about grouse as an umbrella species, and that their decline is consistent with the decline of a broad suite of at-risk wildlife, including those traditionally considered to be more early successional obligates, but also species that are often thought about as more mature forest obligates, but we know require more structural diversity, both kind of at the stand level and also at the landscape level than a lot of our forest landscapes currently provide. We also think about grouse as an indicator, in that they are an indicator for healthy and resilient forest ecosystems that have high age class and structural diversity. I wanted to kind of frame some of this conversation about different desired ecological conditions and about how much late successional forest compared to how much young forest within the concept of ecological integrity, because I think it's a really useful framework. And so, I hate to share too many kind of quotes with people during presentations, but I'll share a couple with you here. Ecological integrity, as defined by the Forest Service in their 2012 planning rule, is the quality or condition of an ecosystem when its dominant ecological characteristics occur within the natural range of variation and can withstand and recover from most perturbances imposed by both environmental dynamics and human influences. Another term that I'll share is ecological zones or ecozones. And ecozones are basically units of land that have specific plant communities or plant community groups based on environmental factors and are driven by things like elevation, aspect, landform, soil moisture, and soil types. This is one of my favorite images that we have for the Southern Blue Ridge, for the Southern Apps. One thing about doing work in the Southern Appalachians is we have a really high diversity of different site conditions. Elevation is synonymous with latitude in the Southern Apps. So we have all of the major forest communities that you would see if you went from Georgia to Maine, but all within these mountains. So when we think about those different sites and we think about these different ecological zones and dominant characteristics across the landscape, the way that we think about ecological integrity varies depending upon the ecological zone and the forest community type that you're operating within. And so here is a breakdown of different natural range of variation structural classes by ecozone for the Nantahala and Pisgah National Forests in North Carolina. So this is a NRV model that was part of an ecological departure analysis that the Forest Service completed as part of their new forest plan revision process. And so just the one thing I want to point out is, this model highlights what the best available science tells us different structural classes were by ecozone pre-Euro-American, right? So this is a baseline. It's an imperfect baseline, but it's a baseline. But I think when we think about managing for late successional management, I think it's important to contextualize those desired late successional old growth conditions that we're trying to manage for at landscape scales based on what's appropriate based on the NRV modeling for that ecozone in that landscape. And so, late successional and old growth, the NRV models show was pretty common in a lot of ecozones, especially more mesic ecozones like acidic and rich coves. It was actually less common in some of our more disturbance frequent fire adapted forest communities such as dry oak and shortleaf pine oak, where you had a higher proportion of young and open and actually a lower proportion of some of those late and old growth conditions. And so this is the problem, right? It's a beautiful forest landscape that we have in the Southern Appalachians, but this is what we refer to from a wildlife habitat perspective as a sea of sameness. The uniformly single-aged closed canopy conditions of a lot of our current Southern Appalachian forest landscape is simply not providing the habitat diversity that a broad suite of at-risk wildlife species need. And so when you look at kind of age class distribution across the landscape, this is just a sample of all of our national forests in the Southern Appalachians, but across what is literally millions of acres of public lands here in the Southern Appalachians, there's currently only 1.3% young forest, and the vast majority of the forests are second growth and about 80 to 120 years old. And so this is pretty consistent with some of the other slides we saw from other presenters, but it's no surprise when you have a landscape that's dominated by closed canopy forests that are middle-aged to mature, that species which require more young forest conditions, as well as species which require more late successional forest conditions, are all declining, and they're all declining at alarming rates. But it's not just forest structure in terms of age class diversity, it's also percent openness. about 50% of our ecological zones or forest types here in the Southern Apps are considered fire adapted. And historically, we know conditions were a lot more open with a higher percentage of woodlands and savannas and grasslands. And so species which require greater herbaceous cover and more open canopy conditions that are more fire driven are also declining across the landscape as well. So this is our challenge and our opportunity. It's to take forests that are currently dominated by single age closed canopy systems, where there's usually an underrepresentation of young forest, open forest, and late successional forest, both from an NRV ecological perspective and from just a pure wildlife habitat perspective. And through conservation planning and through active forest management, increase those proportions of underrepresented habitat to promote more healthy forests and abundant wildlife. And so, one of the primary ways that we have been doing that at the Ruffed Grouse Society is through dynamic forest restoration blocks, or DFRBs. So you've already heard other presenters talk about DFRBs. It's not a framework that we invented. It is a framework that we have been utilizing as our focal area approach and our primary landscape implementation approach. To me, some of the core components of how we think about DFRBs is managing at landscape scales, greater than 1,000 acre blocks, usually in that 30 to 50,000 acre kind of watershed scale, centered on public lands, but also perhaps including private lands within its scope. Planning to assess current conditions and establish desired conditions, and also cover typing in terms of allocating the focal area into different management zones to help guide and inform management. Implementation to achieve desired conditions within that block, and then monitoring to assess both wildlife and vegetative response to our implementation to help inform management, be adaptive, and test our hypotheses. And I think the underlying part of this framework that's really interesting to me is that we need a landscape implementation unit that is both large enough that achieving desired conditions at that scale will have a biologically significant impact on the wildlife species that we're trying to benefit, but also small enough that we can actually achieve those desired conditions under a relatively short time frame, and small enough that we can effectively monitor the impacts of our work. And so we have been very actively trying to move away from random acts of conservation on the landscape, small scale, boutique, single species habitat projects, and really trying to move holistically to managing and restoring functional landscape blocks. And the DFRB framework is a really good way to do that. We've also been strategically working to develop new DFRBs here in the Southern Appalachians, tiered to existing conservation planning efforts. So rather than reinventing any planning wheels, we've been working closely with our partners at the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture to develop DFRBs that are tiered to their focal landscapes, as well as working with partners at NRCS to develop them within kind of golden-winged warbler focal areas established within the Working Lands for Wildlife program. Another more recent partnership that we have is with the Nature Conservancy, where we've been intentionally working to identify both active dynamic forest blocks and also propose DFRBs that align with TNC's resilient and connected network and the focal landscapes within it. And I think the DFRB framework can provide a really useful way to help operationalize and implement the restoration activities to achieve those NRV thresholds within those RCN networks as well. And so here's just an example of some of the way some of that looks like spatially. So this is the Cumberland's focal landscape from the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture. These are two DFRBs that we helped fund and create through a NIFWIF Cumberland's grant. The DFRBs themselves are focused on public lands. They're anchored on state lands, which is really where we focused the planning, implementation, and monitoring. But we also applied private landowner outreach buffers to those public lands. So a primary buffer of 10 miles, a secondary buffer of 25, and a tertiary buffer of 50 to really focus and triage some of the private landowner outreach and private landowner technical and financial assistance that we are providing within these landscapes, with the idea of being able to radiate out habitat conditions beyond the DFRBs into private landowners and the surrounding landscapes, and ultimately, ideally, help expand population densities across that landscape too. And so, Sean and Britt got into this a bit during their presentation, but I'm kind of with a triangle starting big and getting pointed. So I did want to provide a little more detail about the kind of stand level prescription that we've been working on within this DFRB at Catoosa. And so basically we've been working to accelerate structural complexity to move the stand more towards late successional characteristics through a variable density thinning. So the desired conditions that we established for this stand at Catoosa was informed by Landfire's biophysical setting for Allegheny, Cumberland, dry forest, and woodland. And we were very specific in working with TNC and working with TWRA to think about what seral condition within that biophysical setting are we really trying to manage for within this stand. And ultimately, we landed on Class D, which is the late seral closed canopy oak hickory forest. And so that's our target. That's where we are trying to move this stand. And so the prescription that we developed was a variable density thinning with gaps, skips, and matrix. And so those gap areas are those canopy gaps where we're creating 10th to quarter acre sized gaps across 5 to 10% of the stand. The skips are 10th to half acre sized areas that make up 5 to 15% of the stand where we will be doing nothing. And then we're doing a mid-story removal treatment in the matrix between gaps and skips to promote advanced oak regeneration. And we're also doing crop tree release within pre-existing gaps where there's quality crop trees, oaks and hickories that are ready for release. And we're also thinking about kind of a longer fire return interval, 15 to 25 years as a follow-up treatment to the mechanical and herbicide. One thing that I'll share that is maybe a complement to what Britt and Sean already shared is to operationalize this on the ground. We had to think about what are our criteria when we identify and lay out gaps and skips as part of that variable density thinning. And so these are some of the kind of metrics that we landed on. We wanted to center gaps in areas that had existing advanced oak regeneration that were ready for release, where there were already gaps created that looked pretty good that we could expand, where there was an overstory of uncharacteristic trees, where the goal was more to set back those uncharacteristic trees, remove them, or where we had an overstory that had trees with poor form or degradation, and also prioritizing gaps on drier sites that were more south and west aspects. When we thought about skips, places that we would not be doing anything, we wanted to identify areas in the stand that had uncommon or underrepresented trees and rare plants. Where there were existing gaps, where desired trees were competing well and we could just leave them alone. Where there was an abundance of biological legacies, an abundance of dead wood, an abundance of mass-producing trees, unique landscape features like tip-up mounds, perennial and intermittent streams, obviously SMZs, and then some of our more mesic microsites on that north and east-facing aspects. So these are all kind of locations, microsites across the stand where we said, at least one of these criteria should be met to identify this area as a gap or a skip. And that's how we've been moving forward with laying out that treatment on the ground. Yeah, just a couple last things. I think all of this work, especially when we're talking about doing non-commercial late successional management work, needs funding, especially standing up, DFRBs and doing all the planning, implementation, and monitoring within them. So we wouldn't be able to do any of this work without partners. And I think, there are funding sources and partnerships that are out there, whether it's through competitive grant programs like National Fish and Wildlife Foundation programs, Forest Services landscape scale restoration program, or partner agreements. There's different ways that we can work together to leverage external funding and leverage capacity to be able to get the work done. And ultimately, that's how we've been able to be successful, is by working with partners and leveraging resources. So that's all I have. With that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Sean.
All right, thanks, Nick. We're doing a little musical chairs here. Yeah, so just wanted to quickly touch on an example of one of the NIFWIF grants that we're using for a dynamic forest restoration block in Southwest Virginia. So this EFRB is focused on Clinch Mountain Wildlife Management Area, Hidden Valley Wildlife Management Area, and Channel State Forest down in Southwest Virginia, as you can see in the corner of the state there. And we've been working with the Department of Forestry, Department of Wildlife Resources, and several partners to implement this work. Essentially, what we're trying to do is focus on those public land anchors that I just discussed, but we also have private land buffers that Nick mentioned previously. So we're doing private land outreach to try to create more cohesive blocks that we can work, plan, and implement work in hopes of creating more young, open, and late successional conditions. We're also doing baseline monitoring of vegetative conditions, and we're using eBird status and trends data products to collect baseline relative abundance of our focal wildlife species in that area. And we're also, a unique part of this project is we're doing a carbon outcomes analysis. So with that, we're partnering with Terra Carbon, and what they've done is they've tried to model out optimized carbon mitigation levels on the landscape, and then also optimized wildlife habitat, and then finding an equilibrium point of how can we optimize for both. So that's sort of an interesting component of this project as we think about our climate goals balanced with wildlife habitat. Also, as part of this, we want to pilot late successional treatment. So we're excited that this workshop is one component of that. And then finally, we are going to be using the Working Lands for Wildlife program to write forest management plans and connect private landowners to financial assistance. And when we're looking at this project and our focal species, so we've got the golden winged warbler, which is more of our early successional obligate. We've got our cerulean warbler, which is more of our late successional obligate. And then the wood thrush, which is more of our mature forest obligate. We're trying to improve habitat by about 133 acres for each species. And then at a higher level, these are some more of our conservation metrics. So I'll just give you a couple seconds to look that over, but just at a high level, this is what we're trying to accomplish on the landscape. And so as we're here today talking more about late successional old forest characteristics, old growth characteristics, wanted to just highlight one of the treatments we are doing on Clinch Mountain WMA. This is specifically going to be focused on accelerating the development of structural complexity. So looking at more of a younger to middle age stand and trying to accelerate conditions that could lead to old growth characteristics later on. To do that, we want to move that stand to a more diverse and mature stand by creating more within stand structural heterogeneity. We're going to be doing a crop tree release specifically to promote valuable tree species in that 20 to 30 year range, and try to do so through gap creation and spacing that satisfies a basal area of greater than 90 square feet per acre. We're going to be leaving snags. And I think we're doing this keeping in mind best management practices for wood thrush. So managing more for our mature forest obligate here. And in those best management practices by Lambert, he outlines in pole size stands, you want to accelerate the development of high vigorous canopy with light or variable density thinning, crop tree release, or crop tree release with canopy gap formation. And this table here below is also pulled from those BMPs, and so I think it's a good sort of visual of how you can work with a starting condition and move that toward a desired condition, working in both mature stands and then sort of your younger to middle-aged stands. As another part of this project, we're going to have demonstration areas for each of our focal wildlife species. So trying to focus on about 50 acres. So 50 acres for golden wing warbler, 50 acres for cerulean warbler, 50 acres for wood thrush. And we will do this at Clinch Mountain and Channel State Forest. And what we want to do actually as a follow-up to this workshop, and hopefully some of you can attend, is have some field days where we can discuss these demonstration areas, and we can also discuss piloting late successional treatments in these areas. So I'm sure I'll send out an email following up with this workshop, but we would love to do sort of a in-person on the ground field day this summer where we can talk about these different types of management strategies and what that might look like on the ground. So in terms of managing into the future, we talked about this a little bit in our breakout groups. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to manage for late successional conditions. As some of you know, as some of you work for the Forest Service, the National Old Growth Amendment has gotten a lot of attention, which essentially is going to modify the 128 National Forest Land Management Plans. There's been a public scoping and comment period, which we've been involved with, and they're expecting a record of decision to be signed in early 2025. And as part of this, all projects in old growth areas must go through a review process by the deputy chief. And it seems like at the moment, there's not a ton of consensus on how this is going to be interpreted at the forest level. But I think what we've determined is, one, it's a great opportunity to be open to this type of management, and it's top of mind for the Forest Service. At the same time, and through the comment period, we've been trying to be vocal that we are still a fan of sustainable forest management. And we worry that something like this could potentially put an emphasis on old forest over a number of other critical successional stages. So not to say this isn't important, we just don't want to weigh this more than the others, which I think we've talked about today in various presentations. We do want to take that holistic approach that we've discussed and move the landscape more toward these levels that Nick mentioned earlier on to create more young, open, and late successional conditions. I guess finally, just want to say that for this project in Southwest Virginia and for many others, and a lot of folks have echoed this today, but it wouldn't be possible without our partners. So AMJV and the Nature Conservancy have been instrumental not only in planning this workshop, but also with a number of other facets of this project, and also the Department of Wildlife Resources, the Department of Forestry, NWTF, and Quail Forever, some other conservation partners involved, and then Terra Carbon, who's been doing that carbon and wildlife monitoring, assessment. So that's about it for us. I think we just thank everyone for being here today. Obviously, it's probably interesting for us to be on this call for some folks, as I think grouse are always attributed with those early successional conditions, which we definitely still advocate for. But also, we want this holistic approach where we can create more diverse, structurally complex forests that benefit a suite of wildlife species. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, any questions? We have time for questions?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got time for questions. Feel free to come off mute or put your questions in the chat, and Sean and Nick will field them.
You see the chat?
This is Shane Jones. I work for the Forest Service in West Virginia, and I put it in the chat, but I just want to verbalize my chat. Great presentation. I really appreciate your guys' holistic approach. And I've been with the Forest Service for a long time in West Virginia and seeing the transition from a critter club and focusing on young forest habitat to thinking about a working forest. I mean, you're right. For you guys to be here talking at an old forest or late successional habitat webinar is pretty cool. And it's partners like you all that we're really interested in working with into the future. And also liked towards the end, you gave that reference talking about demonstration areas for some different species. Communicating that message to not only other practitioners but to the public is such a big deal. So good stuff, and would be interested in talking more how we could get you up north just a little bit more. I mean, we work close with Ben Larson, but we just all get busy with stuff. But just wanted to offer my appreciation for your presentation. It was really inspiring. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words, Shane. And yeah, we definitely care about those young forests too, and we definitely recognize there's an ecological habitat need for a lot more young forests than is currently on the landscape. But there's also a big need for more late successional and open as well. So yeah, appreciate that. And yeah, we're definitely trying to take a broader holistic approach to restoring landscapes. So thanks, Shane.
And not telling non-government folks what to do, but your comments on the National Old Growth Amendment are not ignored and very spot on, because it doesn't just say we don't like old growth. It talks about the bigger picture and the importance of having to have the ability to manage in the name of conservation. So keep up the good work.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Shane.
Yeah, any other questions? Chat.
Yeah, I think that's it. All right, I think that's all. So yeah, we will kick it over
Yeah.
to Will.
Yeah, thanks, Nick and John, for closing us out there.